Christina Olds. We all met her when she did a fantastic presentation about her father, Robin Olds, and today is going to be just as fascinating because it's about her grandfather. Her grandfather, Major General Robert Olds, was an instrumental leader in the development of early air power. He knew Billy Mitchell. She has an incredible story to tell. Christina is a Vassar College graduate with a degree in creative writing, and if you've ever read her book, you will know she's an incredible writer. She's very sought after by the Air Force and at NATO bases, aviation museums like us, and air shows, and she's nationally and known here in this country and also around the world. We've always been so lucky to have her here. She's always available to be a keynote speaker if we would like for her to be here, which we always do. So she lives in Boise, Idaho. She's one of my best friends. She's the mother of a beautiful daughter, Jennifer Olds Newman, and we are so happy to have her here. I'm going to turn the time over to you. Thank you, Christina.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to run this presentation from over here because I have to cheat a little bit on this one. And the reason is, this is a very complicated story. Most people know my dad, but very few know about my grandfather. And the reality is he had a much huger career than my dad did. And it's a multifaceted story to put together. So my normal presentation on this one is about an hour and a half, and I cut it down vastly, probably by at least 30–40% in order to present this today. But to do that, I created gaps that also created gaps in my memory. So I'm going to have to cheat a little bit and read my slides from over here, but hopefully all of you will be able to see the slides, listen to what I'm saying, and read as we go along. Now the interesting thing is I started working on my grandfather's story in about, 2016. I drove back and forth across the country 2 or 3 times, spent a lot of time at Maxwell, spent a lot of time at Langley, and about 3 months there, Library of Congress, Museum of the Air Force, lots of different places. And I put the story together pretty well, I thought, and I thought I had, with my 9,000 pages of references, I thought I had it all. And then, by accident, I found a paper that referenced the collection of Robert Olds memorabilia donated by Robin Olds at the Air Force Academy Library in 1968. I had no idea about this, and I thought when I cleaned out my dad's house, I wondered where all his dad's stuff was. Well, it turned out to be the mother lode. So what I've done is slowed down on writing the book a little bit so I can incorporate all this new stuff I have. But what you're going to see today, 90% of these images are directly from my grandfather. Okay, here we go. So Robert was born in Maryland in 1896. He went to pilot training at the Curtis Flying School in Newport News in May 1917, and he's seated in the middle down there. He was quickly sought after as an instructor pilot, but since we weren't in the war yet, he joined the Royal Canadian Air Corps as the commander of the 17th Aero Squadron. Then he went over to Issoudun in France as an instructor pilot for many of the pilots that were coming over at that point. And this is where he met Billy Mitchell and became a protege of his, and also became great friends with Eddie Rickenbacker. There's a wonderful image. I love this coat. I wish we still had uniforms like this, although many of you probably wouldn't want them. So he flew SPADs while he was there at Issoudun, and he was there just for the last part of the war, from May 1918 right to the end. And after the war, he came back as a captain and was very briefly in Billy Mitchell's office in Washington, D.C. before he was sent over to Hawaii, where he was made the commander of the first observation group. And you know, the observation group started out with hot air balloons in World War I to watch the enemy. He was credited with the very first night flight over Oahu, the first night flight from Oahu to Molokai, the first flight over Haleakala Crater, flying a de Havilland DH-40, 48, 40B. Correct me. I'll take any corrections you guys can throw out this evening, because I'm going to need a few. All right, and here's a photograph of Pearl Harbor. I just came back from there 2 weeks ago. They have an absolutely wonderful museum there. If any of you haven't been, you must when you can. So while he was there in Hawaii, stationed right at Luke Field, he flew the DH-40, that's Robert on the left. And one of the things he loved to do was to fly over to the Big Island and go deer hunting. And what they would do is shoot the deer and bring them home. How do you bring them home? In your airplane. Either tied on the wing or stuffed in the back cockpit. I love this photograph. If anybody wonders where my dad got his crazy sense of adventure and humor, he got it from his dad. So he would fly the deer back to Oahu, where he'd be met by the chef, who would immediately start up the barbecue and feed the whole squadron. Robert was also quite the rascal in that he would take this seaplane out for a little stroll around the harbor, but it had a bigger purpose than just practicing, because they all water skied behind it. Every time I go to Pearl Harbor, I have to look out at those waters and remember that my grandfather water skied behind an airplane. There's another shot of that. And another one. While he was in Hawaii, he met his wife, Eloise. Eloise Wickman was the daughter of Henry F. Wickman, who started Henry F. Wickman Jewelers. He had come from Germany in the late 1800s. And Henry F. Wickman Jewelers went on as a business for many years and became Nahoku. So Nahoku jewelry stores are all over the world now. Unfortunately, I'm not related to them at all anymore. But my middle name is Eloise, Christina Eloise Olds, so I'm named after my grandmother. And Robert married Eloise in October of 1921. They had young Robin in 1922. When they moved back to Virginia, and Robin was just 2 years old, she had another son, Stephen, and then unfortunately Eloise got stomach cancer and passed away when my dad was only 4 years old. Here's a nice photograph of young Captain Robert. And so what he did when he came back to Washington, D.C. is he went right to work for Billy Mitchell. And most of you know Billy Mitchell was known for his support for air power. He was quite the renegade, totally disliked by the Army and the Navy. Sorry, you guys. Very convinced that we needed air power. General Billy Mitchell did not share in the common belief that World War I would be the war to end war. If a nation ambitious for universal conquest gets off to a flying start in a war of the future, he said, it may be able to control the whole world more easily than a nation has controlled a continent in the past. He went on to predict that Hawaii would be vulnerable to an air attack from Japan. During his 1925 court-martial for his insubordination and his beliefs, he was assisted by my grandfather, Robert Olds, who was his aide, beside him through the entire trial. And this is a shot from the trial. Apparently, my great-grandmother, Robert's mother, attended this trial every day. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed. He resigned in 1926 and then died 10 years later, exonerated basically after he passed away. And of course, we have many things in his honor now, like the Mitchell, the B-25. So then Robert was stationed at Bolling Air Force Base, Air Base at that point, while he was working in Mitchell's War Office in DC. And he was an instructor pilot there at Bolling Field. And during that time, he flew just about every airplane that landed at that field. Here's a Martin bomber. Here's a Handley page. Now, this is curious. This was in his collection of photographs. I think he took this photograph, but I know the Handley Page bomber was a British aircraft. So if anybody here can tell me whether this flew over to the United States, or perhaps Robert might have photographed this when he was in France, please let me know. More photographs of the planes he was flying. There were over 200 photographs that he took or that were taken of him flying during these years. And Robert was known to be the great aerobatic pilot at that time, and so he loved to do aerobatics over Washington, D.C. Look at that. Recognize any of those buildings? There's the Capitol right under him. We couldn't do that today now, could we? Not like this. And so right after this time, he moved down to Langley and went to school as a student at the Air Corps Tactical School, 1928 to 1931. As soon as he graduated in his class in 1928, he became an instructor. They hired him to stay on. One of his first students in the next class was a young pilot named Claire Chenault. So here's a photograph of Robert with the staff in 1928. And another one in 1929. He was in charge of the tactics courses by then. And flying over Langley Field in 1931. And here's a shot of Langley Field. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a B-6 bomber kind of down to the left in the middle, and a flight of P-12s. Another shot is a B-9 in flight. And here's an aerial of Langley Airfield. If any of you have not been to Langley, you really should. It's our oldest air base, and it's absolutely beautiful in design and in construction, and full of history. And I think the first wing is there now, still flying F-22s. So during that time when he was at Langley, he also competed in the Cleveland Air Races, flying a Keystone bomber. And there he is with his crew. And this is just a selection of the bomber aircraft at that time. Bombardment airplanes, the de Havilland DH, 1918, the Keystone in 1928, and the Martin YB in 1936. And here is a series of Martin Bs lined up for a bombing demonstration at Langley. Now during this time, Robert was also known to be one of what they called the bomber mafia, which were the long-haul aircraft believers that we needed bombing capability to get through any war. And so he was part of the crew that was helping to design and push the B-17. Now, I don't know what this aircraft is. If anybody in here can tell me, I'd be really, really grateful. Kind of looks like the nose of a Martin, but I don't know what it is. I think that's a foreign emblem on it. Let me know later if anyone knows. And then he went off with his bomber mafia guys, the Group Headquarters Command and General Staff in 1935 to Fort Leavenworth. And this is where he met and married his next wife and had 2 sons with her. During this time, Robert was promoted to lieutenant colonel, head of the 2nd Bomb Group at Langley, and waiting eagerly for the delivery of the very first B-17s. And there's his general staff, the bomber mafia at Langley Field. There's a YB-17 rolling out at Boeing, in flight, in production at Boeing, and the first one arriving at Langley, Virginia, in March 1st, 1937. Robert Olds was the first commander of the 1st Squadron of B-17s. And that first aircraft was flown by Barney Giles and then navigated by Robert's protege, Curtis LeMay, on the far right. Here's a shot of the entire group in front of number 10, B-17, which was Robert's personal B-17. And when he was in command of the 2nd Bomb Group, he was in charge of training all aspects and tactics and strategy for bombing missions anywhere in the world. He emphasized competency in instrument landings and takeoffs and long-range navigation. This is his photograph of the rest of the B-17s coming in that day, and he wrote, "First formation picture of my B-17 bombers taken upon arrival of the 3rd. Signed Bob, 1937. And I love this shot of B-17 flying over Mount Rainier. People have told me that this was Robert flying this, but I don't know that for sure. I like to think so. And here's his personal number 10. Another one of number 10. And with the crew of number 10. Now during this time, the young Army Air Corps was still trying to make a point of the fact that the Army and Navy really needed the Air Force's help. And so what they did beforehand, Mitchell back in the early 20s had found a warship off the coast. And Robert carried on that mission by proving that long-range bombers could find ships at sea. And in May of 1937, Robert and Caleb Haynes, with navigator Curtis LeMay, intercepted the Italian liner Rex, 620 miles off the east coast. It's kind of hard to see in flight right there. And there's another one. And they found it and they dropped water bombs on it, proving that they could find it. And then later in 1937, Olds and LeMay found the USS Utah off the California coast. And that kind of had a scandal that went along with it because the first day was very foggy and they tried to find it, but after being given coordinates by the Navy, and they found out when they landed, having not found it, that the Navy had given them the wrong coordinates on purpose. The next day, they found it. And then here's Robert leading a group of his B-17s over New York City in September of 1937. Pretty soon, Hollywood got notice of these B-17s that were flying back and forth, making a lot of news. And Victor Fleming, who had been the director of Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz, came to Langley and talked to Robert about being the tactics officer and the advisor for a movie they were going to film about the B-17 and other aircraft called Test Pilot. So Robert flew his squadron out to California and filmed this movie for them. The movie Test Pilot starred Clark Gable, Myrna Loy, and Spencer Tracy. Started filming in late 1937 and premiered in April of 1938. And this is a shot of Robert in the lead with his boys flying for Test Pilot. And in January 1938, Robert set the transcontinental multi-engine record from Langley, Virginia to Marchfield in 12 hours and 50 minutes, and back in 10 hours and a bit, over 2,000 miles. And this is him during the filming of the movie. So right around this time, we were trying to make really good friends with the South Americans, Argentinians, Brazilians. As the war, things in Europe were starting to heat up. And so Roosevelt decided that he wanted to send a goodwill team down to South America to make our presence known and to show off these new B-17s. So Robert was chosen to lead this. And this is in February of 1938 as he's preparing. He's the one in the middle to fly to South America. And at that time, they had no maps. They had no aerial maps at all. So Robert and Curtis LeMay had to go up to the National Geographic office in New York and beg for maps so that they could figure out where the mountains were and how high everything was and how long everything was. And so they had these huge maps from the National Geographic office to help them as they flew down there. I have his entire diary of this flight. It's quite astonishing, the risk they took, especially when they were flying over the Andes. So this is where Robert is receiving Roosevelt's letter to deliver to President-elect Ortiz in Buenos Aires. And this is the group in flight for the inauguration of the new president. First non-stop to Lima, 2,695 miles in 15 and a half hours, and then another 2,200 miles in 12 hours down to Buenos Aires. Landed to great fanfare. Spent a lot of time speaking with the Argentinian officials there. Presented the letter to President-elect Ortiz. And then Robert was presented by this beautiful plaque to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Olds. In these times of world concerns and anxiety, we, the youth of the new generation of Argentina, are messengers of the peace and friendship of Pan America. And in March of 1937, Lieutenant Colonel Olds returned to the White House and told FDR, 1938, that should read, told FDR that the 6 B-17s had proven themselves superior to any other plane for defending the United States. And here he is receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross for that goodwill flight. And he also received the Mackey Trophy for commanding the 2nd Bomb Wing Goodwill flight. I took this photograph of the Mackey Trophy in the Smithsonian just a few years ago. It was awarded every year to the outstanding air crew or individual for the advancement of Army Air Corps. In August 1938, Lieutenant Colonel Olds delivers the only XB-15 ever built, called Grandpappy, long-range heavy bomber from Boeing in Seattle, and lands at Langley. Its great size and weight proved slower than the B-17 and was converted to cargo. In February of 1939, the XB-15 flew medical supplies to Chile after the big earthquake, and the group won a 2nd Mackey Trophy. Now this is something I love. I have the original of this. Robert's escapades became pretty well known to the point where he was always in the news, and there was Sunday comics made for him describing his history from the Curtis Flying School to the Royal Flying Corps in Canada, then the 2nd Army at Issoudun, and then instructor and record breaker in the B-17. Longest flight, fastest across the US and back over the highest mountains. So the interesting thing about this is this was actually written by his good friend, Eddie Rickenbacker. This is about the time where my dad met Eddie Rickenbacker. Oops. So here's young Robert's family. That's my dad, Robin, standing in the back on the right. He was 17 years old here in 1939. His younger brother, Stephen, next to him. And then the 2 boys, Dusty and Frederick, with Robert's 2nd wife on his knee. And right around this time, Robert had been promoted to be head of the bomb group, commanding officer and staff. And there is Curtis LeMay at the far right. And his number 10 air crew and his big staff, with Curtis standing right behind him. Now, whatever people think about Curtis LeMay and what he ended up doing later in his life, he thought the world of Robert Olds, and in one of his many books he writes that Robert Olds was the finest air officer he had ever met, and goes into great detail on the respect he had for him. And here's General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, bidding farewell to Olds before the second Goodwill flight to South America in November of 1939. I don't know who this gentleman is on the right. I'm hoping to find out someday. And there's Robert emerging from his aircraft. May 28, 1941, by order of President Roosevelt, General Hap Arnold names Brigadier General Robert Olds head of the new Air Corps Ferrying Command. At this time, son Robin is 18 years old and starting right at West Point. So Robert, in his office, had a guy named Robert Love as his assistant, and Robert Love's wife, Nancy Harkness Love, was a pilot. They all had dinner together one evening, and Robert said to Nancy, "You know what? I think that you women can deliver these planes over to England. So the guys can train for combat. I really think we should do that. And I'd like you to put together a list of women pilots who have commercial licenses and let me know, and let's start putting together a group." And so Nancy Love and Robert Olds formed what was called the WAFs, the Women Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. They took the idea to Hap Arnold, who objected completely. He said, "Women can never fly these aircraft." But Robert said, "Yes, they can." And he persisted, and they started delivering planes to England in June of 1942. This was before Jackie Cochran got her group together. And here's Nancy Love, head of the WAFs, and they merged with Jackie Cochran's group and formed the WASP in June of 1943. Here's part of the map of Robert's plans on how to get the aircraft across to Europe. They'd fly over from Greenland, or they'd fly down to South America and bounce over to Africa and then up to Italy and up to England in that way. It was a hugely complicated mission. And during that time, Robert got promoted to take command of the 2nd Air Force in May 14, 1942. It was headquartered at Fort George Wright and Geiger Field in Spokane, which is now the Spokane Airport, with satellite bases in Idaho and Montana for training of crews and deployment of heavy bombers to theaters in Europe and the Pacific. And here's Robert inspecting his troops. And I don't know if this is Gowan Field, but it could be. I have another one that's labeled Gowan Field. And during this time, before this time, his second marriage had fallen apart, and Robert had met a young woman that he fell madly in love with, and she fell madly in love with him. Her name was Nina Gore Auchincloss. She was the daughter of U.S. Senator Thomas Gore of Oklahoma. She married Eugene Vidal, 1922 to 35, and had their son, Gore Vidal, the writer. So my dad was stepbrothers with Gore Vidal and told me that that was quite an experience. She divorced Vidal and married Hugh Auchincloss, 1935 to 41, had 2 children with him. And then she met Robert Olds in 1941 and divorced Auchincloss, who then married Janet Lee Bouvier, the mother of Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. Nina married Robert Olds, June of 1942. Robin cared for Grandma Nina until her death in 1978, and I have wonderful memories of her. So at that time, Nina was with Robert up in Spokane, and also traveling around with him as he viewed the troops. And this one is at Gowan Field, July 20, 1942. And this is another one of him reviewing the troops. Now, I don't know that this is Gowan. It could be in Felts Field. I'm actually going to give a speech up at Phelps Field in late March, and I'm going to dig into the history up there and find out. And here he is reviewing the troops at Phelps, congratulating young men, more reviewing. And this time, all during this time, his job was, as head of the 2nd Air Force, was to train the bomber pilots who were flying all over the world, going to the Pacific and over to Europe. And it got a lot of attention. Lana Turner came and visited the headquarters. And there he is with Lana. This is a photograph of him at Phelps Field. I'm actually taking this enlarged with me when I go up there in March. And Jimmy Stewart was a B-24 pilot with the 29th Bombardment Group of the 2nd Air Force under the command of Major General Robert Olds at this time. And here's Robert meeting with one of his contemporaries. Everything was heating up, and right around this time, Hap Arnold had a massive heart attack and was very ill. And Robert started to be ill too. The pressure that they were under as they were involved in World War II and planning all the tactics that were going back and forth was immense. This was his portrait taken when he became a major general. Oops, sorry. Stepping out of his aircraft, on the phone. December 1942, he started to become really ill. Had a hard time breathing, but still working really hard. And by February of 1943, his hair had turned white. Still planning, still working. And he fell ill and had to resign his command and went down to a sanatorium in Arizona in the end of March of 1943, and Nina went with him. Well, by the time he got very, very ill, and they knew he wasn't going to last, they sent a B-17 to pick up Robin at West Point and his brother Stephen, who was there as a freshman. Robin was 1 month shy of his graduation. They flew down to Arizona and were able to be by their father's bedside for a day before he passed away. And after then, Robert was cremated and his ashes were scattered from a B-17 over the mountains near Tucson, Arizona. And when my dad graduated from West Point a month later, he dedicated his commission to the memory of his father. So Robert Olds died on April 19th, 1943, a major general and only 46 years old. People have wondered what he might have become if he had stayed alive, because all of his contemporaries at that time rose up into the highest ranks of the military and on into politics, as we all know. So I never got to know my grandfather, of course. My dad tells me we would have adored each other. I think he had the same kind of sense of humor and adventure that my dad did. And so for me, it's a great privilege to carry his story forward, because this is where it all begins, before World War I and the start of flight, 1903. And here we are now with the James Webb Telescope, 1 million miles from Earth, waiting to point and take photographs for through the rest of the universe. It's amazing what's happened in just the last 120 years, but here we are. And all of you are a result of these wonderful men and women who gave their lives and gave their service to the country through all the services. And I just want to thank you for being together here. It's part of why I decided to move to Boise, is I needed this family around me. And I have really found a family here. So thank you very, very much. It's been an honor to speak with you this morning. And in the memory of my grandfather and my father, I thank you.
see it.
If you have questions, then there's time to take a few questions, and Christina said she'd be happy to answer anything you have. Anybody have a question? I know it's kind of overwhelming. Can we hardly wait for this next book? Really, about her grandfather? Yes.
Wait a minute, hold on.
Will you ever have Paul to get up in front again?
Ever have what?
Have Paul to get up in front again?
Will I ever have? I don't think I'll ever have balls.
This is why she's
Sorry,
my best
but, you know, I
friend.
mean, I can do a lot of things, but I guarantee you that ain't one of them.
Paul!
No, I heard you. Okay.
So I need to ask a question. Is anyone in here a backcountry pilot? Have you ever shot a deer and brought it home in the cockpit of your biplane?
Well, we cannot thank you enough, and I have given Christina so many coins. I'm not going to give her another one, but I'm giving her a hat.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You are more than welcome. Let's thank her again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.